The iron gate of Buchenwald bears the inscription, Jedem das Sein, to each his own. Its message, intended as cruel irony by the Nazis, greets viewers with foreboding. Beyond the gate lies a landscape of dread. In April 1945, as World War II neared its end, American liberators forced local German citizens to walk through Buchenwald concentration camp and witness unspeakable horrors. The air is thick with the stench of death and smoke. The ground is littered with gaunt survivors and stacked corpses. The atmosphere is heavy, silent, but for the sobs of the living and the distant crackle of burning remains. The scene is a glimpse into hell on earth, and at its center looms the legacy of one woman, Ilse Koch, the Witch of Buchenwald, whose name would become synonymous with sadistic cruelty. A liberated prisoner displays a piece of tattooed human skin, a gruesome souvenir taken from Buchenwald. On display for the stunned onlookers in 1945 are preserved human remains, organs and jars, shrunken heads, and pieces of tattooed human skin, allegedly stripped from prisoners. A table lamp sits nearby, its shade stitched from what appears to be human flesh. These gruesome artifacts are said to be the trophies of Ilse Koch, wife of the camp commandant. This woman had a mania for unusual tattoos, reported one American journalist, describing how Koch allegedly collected the skin of inmates with elaborate tattoos. Thus, before the world even knows her face, Ilse Koch's dark legend is born, amid the horror of liberated Ilse Koch began life far from death camps and torture chambers. Born Marguerite Ilse Koller in Dresden in 1906, she was, by all accounts, a polite, unremarkable girl. As a teenager, she studied accounting and found work as a bookkeeper. But Germany in the 1920s and 30s was a nation in turmoil. Humiliated by defeat in World War I and strangled by economic ruin, like many young Germans, Ilse was drawn to the rising Nazi Party's promises of revival. In 1932, at age 26, she joined the Nazi Party NSDAP, embracing Adolf Hitler's toxic ideology under the guise of national pride and restoration. Through the party she met Carlotto Koch, an ambitious SS officer. They married in 1936, and Heinrich Himmler himself approved their union. This marriage would tether Ilse to the Nazi camp system, and to the horrors that would earn her the infamous title Witch of Buchenwald. In 1937, Karl Koch was appointed commandant of a new concentration camp built near Weimar, Germany. The camp's name was Buchenwald, German for beech forest, suggested by Karl himself for the woods surrounding it. Ilse, eager to share in her husband's rise, moved into a luxurious villa on the camp grounds. The wrought iron camp gate bore the slogan, Jedem das Sein, everyone gets what he deserves. Each morning Ilse could see those words as she stepped out of the commandant's mansion, a grim promise to the prisoners and a motto that she would viciously enforce in the years to come. At Buchenwald, Ilse Koch transformed from an unremarkable clerk into a figure of pure terror. Initially a young mother, she bore several children in the late 1930s. Even as tens of thousands of inmates suffered around her, Ilse's maternal duties did not soften her heart. By all accounts, she relished her unofficial power as the commandant's wife and actively participated in the cruelty. Wives of SS officers later recalled how Ilse would watch punishment roll calls where prisoners were forced to stand naked, motionless for hours in all weather. She derived visible pleasure from their torment. Soon she began taking an even more direct role in Buchenwald's brutality, her sadism unleashed. Survivors of Buchenwald would never forget Ilse Koch's presence. They called her the Witch of Buchenwald, Die Hex von Buchenwald, because of her extreme cruelty and depravity. Ilse was often seen dressing provocatively, sometimes riding around the camp on horseback in tight riding attire, or even with her blouse open, deliberately taunting the starving prisoners. If any prisoner as much as raised his eyes to glance at her, she would retaliate with merciless violence. If a prisoner looked at her, he was beaten, survivors recalled bluntly. At the best of times, a beating or flogging was the punishment for the crime of noticing Ilse. At worst, a prisoner who caught her attention might be shot or marked for death on the spot. Inmates quickly learned to avert their gaze and cower whenever the commandant's wife approached. Yet the Witch of Buchenwald seemed to delight in the fear she evoked. Ilse's cruelties were both bizarre and sadistic. She was known to stroll the campgrounds with her breasts exposed, enjoying the effect on the prisoners and the pretext it gave her to inflict punishment. On other days, she took her horseback rides straight through groups of inmates. Mounted high in her saddle like a predatory huntress, Ilse would gallop past work details. More than once, she trampled prisoners beneath her horse's hooves. Armed with a riding crop, she would whip prisoners arbitrarily, a predatory gleam in her eye as men screamed and collapsed around her. During later war crimes trials, former inmates testified that Koch seemed particularly excited whenever she could send even children to their deaths. No victim was too vulnerable. If it increased the terror, Ilse Koch reveled in it. The entire camp was her stage for cruelty. Early on, Ilse arranged a project that symbolized her twisted priorities, using money stolen from murdered inmates. She ordered the construction of a lavish indoor riding arena for her personal use. This sports hall, which cost an estimated $62,500 over $1 million today, was built by slave labor. Mirrors lined the walls so Ilse could admire herself on horseback. During its construction, at least 30 prisoners died from exhaustion, their lives spent to fulfill Ilse Koch's vanity. Not satisfied with an arena, she even had a private zoo built just outside the camp fences, stocked with bears, wolves, and monkeys for her amusement. While prisoners in rags ate watery soup and buried their comrades, Ilse Koch fed animals and rode horses in a custom hall of mirrors. This obscene contrast only underscored her utter lack of humanity. Among all of Ilse Koch's perversions, one ghastly obsession made her name truly infamous. Prisoners noticed her peculiar interest in their tattoos. Ilse would wander the camp or stand at attention during inmate inspections, scanning for anyone with elaborate tattooed designs on their skin, according to multiple witness testimonies. She ordered special roll calls for tattooed prisoners at her command. A group of inmates with tattoos would be forced to strip to the waist while she walked among them, scrutinizing their skin. Those with the most interesting or unusual tattoos were marked. She looked closely at the tattoos, and those with the more interesting drawings were later killed on her orders. One witness stated after the war, the selected prisoners would indeed be murdered, and then their tattooed skin was flayed from their bodies. Ilse Koch allegedly turned this human skin into macabre keepsakes. Lampshades, book covers, gloves, and other household items were said to adorn the Koch's villa, fashioned from the tanned skin of murdered inmates. In one account, Ilse displayed a lampshade made of human skin with a distinctive tattoo, as casually as another person might display fine china. Other times she reportedly gifted or showed off human skin bookbindings and knife sheaths, curiosities to shock and impress her SS guests. Within the confines of Buchenwald, these grisly trophies became an open secret, a source of both terror and dark fascination. Inmates whispered about Ilse's collection, imagining the fates of those who had donated their hides. It added a supernatural aura to her cruelty. She was not only torturing and killing, but harvesting the bodies of her victims like a predator collecting skins. Whether Ilse Koch truly had lampshades made of human skin has been debated, but in the infernal reality of Buchenwald, the belief in her atrocities was powerful. Survivors later described how the very idea of Ilse's human lampshades struck dread in the prisoners' hearts, a constant reminder that in this place, under the Koch's rule, they were seen as less than human, raw materials for sadistic whims. It is little wonder that the inmates called her a witch and a monster. Her lasciviousness and bloodthirst had made her one of the most feared women in the Third Reich. Yet for several years, Ilse Koch carried on with impunity, indulging in cruelty beyond even the horrific norm of concentration camps. Eventually, however, the widening gyre of her depravity would draw the attention of even her Nazi superiors and set the stage for her downfall. By 1943, as the war raged on, rumors about the Kochs had reached the upper echelons of the SS. Ironically, it was not compassion for prisoners that spurred an investigation, but corruption and unauthorized murder. Ilse's husband, Commandant Karl Koch, had grown enormously wealthy from embezzling valuables seized from murdered inmates. The Kochs were living extravagantly, and not all of their crimes could be swept under the rug. SS investigators, led by SS Judge Konrad Morgan, descended on Buchenwald. They uncovered that Karl Koch had secretly enriched himself and even ordered the murder of certain prisoners to cover up his misdeeds. One infamous example: Karl had an inmate doctor executed to hide that he himself had syphilis. Ilse, for her part, was accused of participating in some of these crimes and other brutalities that were not officially sanctioned by the SS. On the 24th of August, 1943, Ilse and Karl Koch were arrested by the SS Right at Buchenwald. The spectacle must have been surreal for the prisoners, the once untouchable rulers of Buchenwald led away, in handcuffs by their own comrades. Charges included embezzlement, fraud, and murder. In an ironic twist, the Nazi regime, which had perpetrated mass murder, sought to punish the Kochs not for killing inmates per se, but for killing them without authorization and stealing beyond their allowed spoils. The SS insisted that every punishment or execution be cleared by headquarters. The Kochs had made Buchenwald their personal terror domain, flouting orders. As one account noted, even the Nazi authorities found that the Kochs' sadism did not find its way into their ideology. In other words, it was cruelty for cruelty's sake. The Kochs' trial by an SS court took place in late 1944. Karl Koch was found guilty on multiple counts. In a final stroke of dark justice, he was sentenced to death by his own SS. In April 1945, just days before American forces liberated Buchenwald, Commandant Koch was executed by firing squad inside the camp he once ruled. Ilse Koch's fate in this Nazi trial was different, lacking sufficient evidence tying her directly to the most egregious crimes, such as the murder for tattoos scheme. The SS court acquitted Ilse Koch of the murder charges. She was found guilty only of a lesser charge, perhaps receiving stolen goods, and served a relatively short term in a Gestapo prison, 16 months, before being released in early 1945. By the spring of 1945, with her husband dead and the Third Reich collapsing, Ilse was a free woman. She faded into the chaos of post-war Germany, taking her children and moving to the city of Ludwigsburg under her maiden name. For a brief moment, it seemed the Witch of Buchenwald might escape retribution. But the survivors of Buchenwald had not forgotten. After the camp's liberation, stories of Ilse Koch's atrocities spread across the world. Former prisoners told liberators and journalists about the sadistic commandant's wife with her whip, her human skin lampshades, and her icy smile. Ilse became a notorious figure in the press, dubbed the Witch of Buchenwald, in lurid headlines. In 1945, amid the rubble of the defeated Reich, the American military government began tracking down war criminals. Ilse tried to remain inconspicuous, but fate intervened on a street one day. A Buchenwald survivor recognized her face in passing. In an instant, the alarm was raised. Ilse Koch was arrested by U.S. military police in June 1945. Accounts vary, but she was definitely in American custody by 1946. The Witch of Buchenwald would finally face the judgment of the world. In 1947, Ilse Koch was brought to trial as the only female defendant in the American military tribunal prosecuting crimes at Buchenwald. Clad in a neat dress, her red hair demurely styled, she cut a very different figure from the Schiedemann described by witnesses. Yet the courtroom testimony soon bridged that gap. The proceedings, held at Dachau, site of the first Nazi camp, now repurposed for trials, drew intense media attention. Journalists from around the world packed in to see the woman who had become a symbol of Nazi female depravity. They were not disappointed. Over the course of weeks of testimony, survivors recounted Ilse's sadism in ghastly detail. Her horseback assaults, her delight in floggings, her role in selecting prisoners for death. Ilse sat in the dock, at times appearing aloof, at other times pale and tense, as witness after witness condemned her actions. The chief prosecutor, L.T. Cole, William Denson, spared no words in characterizing Ilse Koch's inhumanity. No woman, in the usual sense, but a creature from some other tortured world. Denson called her, portraying Ilse as almost a supernatural horror. He and his team charged Koch under a broad indictment of participating in a common design to commit war crimes, meaning they did not have to prove she personally killed anyone, only that she was part of the apparatus of brutality at Buchenwald. Still, Denson presented specific accusations that Ilse had abused prisoners, beaten them with riding crops, and yes, that she had instigated the murder of tattooed inmates to make gruesome keepsakes. In the public's eyes, she was already the concentration camp murderess incarnate. Midway through the trial came a sensational revelation that stunned the court. Ilse Koch was pregnant. In August 1947, as the trial neared its end, 41-year-old Ilse announced that she was 8 months pregnant, a fact that visibly shocked the judges and observers. She had been in custody for over 2 years, supposedly with no access to men except American guards and interrogators, some of whom were Jewish, which fueled scandalous rumors. The pregnancy was inexplicable and became an enduring mystery. Had Ilse Koch been raped or seduced a guard? Or, as many speculated, had she engineered an illicit affair to become pregnant deliberately, hoping for sympathy or a lighter sentence? She never revealed the father's identity. The image of the Witch of Buchenwald standing in court, visibly heavy with child, only added to the grotesque drama of the trial. On August 14, 1947, the verdict came. Ilse Koch was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison for war crimes. As the judgment was read, she remained stone-faced, but observers noted a tremble in her hands. Her newborn baby, a son, whom she named Yu, was taken from her care shortly after birth in prison and handed to a German foster family. At that moment, it seemed Ilse Koch's story would end with her languishing behind bars until she died. But the saga was far from over. In the years following her conviction, surprising twists ignited public furor and forced Koch back into the courtroom. After Ilse Koch's conviction by the U.S. military court, her case underwent routine review by American authorities. It was here that the cracks in the evidence began to show. 2 Army lawyers examining the trial record were disturbed by what they saw as weak proof. They noted that despite the horrific newspaper reports, the actual trial documents contained little convincing evidence of Koch's worst alleged actions. In particular, the famous accusation that she had ordered inmates killed for their tattooed skin was not strongly supported in court. The record is especially silent on that charge. They wrote in their review, the lawyers found that much of the testimony was hearsay or speculation. Although Koch was unquestionably guilty of abuse, even she admitted to some beatings. No deaths or serious injuries were directly attributed to her in the evidence. The final decision on Ilse's fate fell to General Lucius D. Clay, the American military governor in occupied Germany. In June 1948, Clay made a highly controversial move. He commuted Ilse Koch's life sentence to just 4 years. Clay's reasoning, delivered with obvious distaste, was that under the specific war crimes charges, the evidence did not justify a life term. There was no convincing evidence that she had selected inmates for extermination in order to secure tattooed skins, or that she possessed any articles made of human skin, Clay announced, echoing the review board's findings. He openly acknowledged Koch was a woman of depraved character and ill repute who had done many reprehensible things, but stressed, "We were not trying her for those things. We were trying her as a war criminal on specific charges." In other words, moral guilt was not enough. Legal proof was required, and in Clay's view, it was lacking for the worst allegations. When news of Ilse Koch's impending release hit the public in September 1948, outrage erupted. After all the blood spilled and the testimony of survivors, many could not comprehend how the Witch of Buchenwald might walk free in a matter of months. Major American newspapers thundered in protest. In the name of basic human justice and decency, what further proof does the army need to slap Ilse into jail and keep her there? Demanded the Miami Herald, reflecting the general incredulity. The New York Post labeled the decision Clay's counter-atrocity and said it was almost beyond credence. Veteran groups and the American Jewish Congress held protest rallies at some demonstrations. Furious picketers even waved lampshades aloft as symbolic reminders of Koch's alleged crimes, chanting for justice. General Clay himself, visiting the U.S., was picketed by protesters, some carrying lampshades and signs demanding his ouster. The public simply could not reconcile the legal technicalities with the monstrous image of Ilse Koch that had seared itself into the collective consciousness. The pressure worked. Under intense public and political scrutiny, U.S. authorities reconsidered the approach. In 1949, as Ilse Koch was released from the American prison at Landsberg, having served only a few years of her commuted sentence, she was immediately rearrested by German authorities to face new charges. A U.S. Senate committee even held hearings on her case, with Senator Homer Ferguson concluding that Koch's violence, being a woman acting independently, was more unnatural and more deliberate, and urging that she receive the just punishment she so justly deserves. The Americans handed Ilse over to the nascent West German justice system, ensuring that this time she would be tried under German law for crimes against German nationals, a jurisdiction the U.S. court did not have. In November 1950, Ilse Koch's second trial commenced before a West German court in Augsburg. The proceedings lasted 7 weeks and were exhaustive. A staggering 250 witnesses were called, including 50 who testified in Koch's defense. The defendant, now in her mid-40s, appeared pale, heavier, and visibly aged. Throughout the trial, she sometimes seemed a shadow of the imperious woman from Buchenwald. At one point she collapsed in a faint, overwhelmed either by stress or perhaps by a strategic display of frailty. She collapsed repeatedly, in fact, in late December 1950 and again in January 1951. Her attorneys claimed she was suffering from mental strain, but if Ilse hoped to garner pity, the evidence presented swiftly extinguished it. Witness after witness, many former Buchenwald inmates, recounted how Koch had incited murder and torture. At least 4 witnesses swore under oath that they had seen Ilse select tattooed prisoners for execution or had participated in preserving tattooed skin and making lampshades from it. The infamous tattoo charges were revisited in grisly detail. However, as in the previous trial, when push came to shove, no physical lampshades or human skin artifacts could be unequivocally tied to Ilse, lacking the actual items or definitive forensic proof. The prosecution ultimately dropped the specific charge regarding the human skin lampshades during the trial. It remained a terrible allegation, but not one they could legally prove beyond doubt. Ilse Koch herself took the stand and maintained a stance of broad denial. In a particularly chilling statement, she claimed, "I never saw anything at Buchenwald which might have been against humanity. I was too busy raising my 2 children." This brazen insistence of ignorance, that as a mother and housewife she simply hadn't noticed the daily killings, torture, and slave labor around her, undoubtedly rang hollow. The court noted her stubborn and irresponsible denial of all guilt, and indeed, the judges were not swayed. On January 15, 1951, the West German court delivered a scathing 111-page verdict. Ilse Koch, who pointedly did not attend the final session, was found guilty of multiple counts: incitement to murder, incitement to attempted murder, and incitement to grievous bodily harm. Essentially, The court held her responsible for goading and ordering others, usually SS subordinates, to commit lethal brutality on her behalf. She was once again sentenced to life imprisonment, with permanent forfeiture of her civil rights. In its written judgment, the court made a point of condemning Ilse Koch's particularly egregious betrayal of basic human feeling. The verdict stated that as a woman, she had consciously suppressed any feeling of compassion and pity, giving free rein to her pursuit of power and prestige, her arrogance and her selfishness. Her crimes were heinous not only in their cruelty, but because she had so utterly inverted the expected nurturing role of a woman, embracing evil with open eyes. With that, the legal saga finally closed. The Witch of Buchenwald would live out her days behind bars. Ilse Koch began her life sentence at Eikoch Women's Prison in Bavaria. The cell that awaited her was a far cry from the lavish villa she'd enjoyed at Buchenwald. Cold stone walls and iron bars replaced the comforts of her former life. Here there were no mirrors, no silken dresses, no servile guards, only the austere routine of incarceration and the inescapable company of her own conscience. If Buchenwald had been Ilse's kingdom of power, Eikoch became her personal purgatory. Over the years, Ilse Koch petitioned repeatedly for clemency or a pardon, clinging to the hope of release. Each attempt was rejected by the Bavarian Ministry of Justice. She even went so far as to appeal to international authorities, at one point lodging a protest with the International Human Rights Commission, but to no avail. Public sentiment was firmly against her. In post-war Germany, she was widely regarded as a national shame, a female embodiment of Nazi barbarity. And so, the years dragged on. The woman who once strutted imperiously through a concentration camp now spent her middle age, scrubbing prison floors and sitting quietly in a cell, invisible and forgotten by the world, except as a cautionary tale. Within the confines of prison, Ilse's mental state deteriorated. As time passed, she grew increasingly isolated and prone to dark thought. Prison doctors noted that she suffered from delusions. Ilse became convinced that vengeful concentration camp survivors would one day infiltrate the prison to exact revenge on her, abusing her as she had abused others. These paranoid nightmares stalked her, waking and sleeping, in a cruel twist. The terror she had inflicted on others now echoed back onto herself. In the dead of night, perhaps she could almost hear the phantom screams of Buchenwald's victims in the rustling of the prison walls. The psychological horror of her own making enveloped her. Ilse Koch was haunted by ghosts of an evil past that would not let her rest. One human connection did come into Ilse's life during her imprisonment. In the 1960s, her youngest child, Yu, the son born from her mysterious pregnancy during the Dachau trial, learned the truth of his parentage. As a teenager, Yu discovered that the infamous Ilse Koch was his mother. In 1966, the young man reached out and began to visit Ilse in prison. For the first time in decades, Ilse experienced something like familial warmth. Her son, innocent of her crimes, came faithfully to see her and corresponded with her. Other family ties had long since frayed. Her older son Artwin had died by suicide in 1964, and her surviving daughter wanted nothing to do with her. But Yu's visits seemed to momentarily pierce Ilse's despair. Perhaps in those meetings she could pretend to be just a mother talking to her son, not the Witch of Buchenwald. It was not enough. By 1967, Ilse Koch was 60 years old and had spent over 15 years behind bars. Her petitions exhausted and her mind in torment, she saw only one escape from the cell that had become her world. On the morning of September 1st, 1967, guards at Eikoch prison found Ilse Koch dead in her cell. She had hanged herself with a bedsheet tied to the window bars. The Witch of Buchenwald had taken her own life. In a final note addressed to her son Yu, Ilse wrote, "There is no other way. Death for me is a release." It was as close to an admission of guilt and suffering as she ever gave. Death, the very thing she had dispensed so freely to others, was the only freedom she could find for herself. Ilse Koch was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery, with no ceremony and no mourners. Thus ended the life of one of history's most notorious war criminals. Yet, even in death, her story retains a chilling afterlife. The debate over her alleged human skin lampshades, for instance, has never been fully settled. The actual lampshade described by witnesses was never recovered after the war. Decades later, in 2006, a peculiar lampshade surfaced in a New Orleans garage sale and made news when tests hinted it might be human skin, only for later DNA analysis to suggest it was actually made of cowhide. Historians and writers like Mark Jacobson have chased this grotesque legend, but the truth remains murky. It seems this was one final secret that Ilse Koch took with her to the grave. The tale of Ilse Koch is a real-life horror story that defies comprehension. How could a seemingly normal woman descend to such depths of sadism? Was she a true monster, or a warped product of the Nazi system, who amplified its evil with her personal perversions? These questions linger in the historical record like the smoke that once billowed from Buchenwald's crematorium. To the survivors who suffered under her gaze, there is no ambiguity. Ilse Koch was cruelty incarnate. She was the Witch of Buchenwald, a name spoken in the camp with a mix of terror and hatred. Even amid a regime notorious for brutality, she stood out, her infamy ensured by the shocking nature of her alleged hobbies and the coldness of her demeanor. In the end, Ilse Koch's life illustrates the banality and the extremity of evil. She was a mother of 3, who claimed she was too busy with the children to notice genocide. Yet evidence shows she went out of her way to invent new cruelties to inflict. She lived in privilege next to a pit of misery, enjoying tea parties and horseback rides while the screams of the tortured echoed in the distance. If her story evokes dread and unease, it is because it forces us to confront a frightening truth, that a human being, a woman, a wife, a mother, can choose to become an instrument of nightmare. Ilse Koch's name now stands as a symbol, a dark legend of the Holocaust. In popular culture, she has been depicted as the archetype of the sadistic camp mistress, from pulp novels to films, a fate she ironically feared, as her prison delusions suggest. As we turn the last page on Ilse Koch's story, we are left with images that will forever haunt the corridors of history. A rusty gate, proclaiming to each his own, while innocents writhe under the lash. A once respectable woman smiling with unnatural excitement at the sight of human suffering. Liberated prisoners holding up pieces of tattooed skin to demand justice for the dead. These are the fragments of a nightmare that was all too real. Ilse Koch sought power and gratification through terror and depravity, and ultimately reaped despair and destruction. In her final act, calling death a release, one might hear an echo of remorse, or simply the last escape of a tormented soul. Ilse Koch is gone, but her story stands as a warning from the abyss. It urges us to remember the horrors that unchecked cruelty can unleash. It urges us to listen to the voices of the survivors, whose testimonies cut through the darkness with truth. Above all, it reminds us that the real horror is not in mythical witches or monsters, but in ordinary people who choose to become monsters. The Witch of Buchenwald chose that path, and her legacy is written in blood and fear. May such a nightmare never rise again. If this story left you disturbed, speechless, or simply more aware of the darkness hidden in human history, subscribe for more true crime and psychological horror stories from the past. Like the video to help others uncover forgotten atrocities. Comment below. What do you think drives someone to such cruelty? And remember, history, no matter how horrifying, must never be forgotten.